The Sparking or Budokai Tenkaichi series revolutionized Dragon Ball combat in gaming, putting 3D free-flying fighting on home consoles, and these games would garner a massive fan base, with Tenkaichi 3 becoming a beloved classic and Sparking Zero being one of the best-selling titles of 2024. However, just a year before the initial release of Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi, we got a taste of that gameplay on the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. In North America, the company Infogrames had major license access to Dragon Ball Z, enabling them to create a slew of Dragon Ball GBA games of mostly middling quality. It wasn't until 2004 when Japan saw their first Game Boy Advance game produced entirely in Japan. This game was Budokai Tenkaichi, also known as Supersonic Warriors in North America. Supersonic Warriors would be the first Dragon Ball game developed in part by Arc System Works, with them going on to develop Dragon Ball Z Extreme Butoden and the groundbreaking Dragon Ball FighterZ. The game's title, Budokai Tenkaichi, means dramatic war in the skies, and this underscores the game's main feature, a focus on air combat, where you could technically fight the entirety of a match on the ground, but at any moment you could take into the air and navigate around opponents in full 360 space. And this is important as you generally need this to flank your opponents, dodge, and avoid damage from key attacks and special moves. This design philosophy matches a lot with the Sparking or Budokai Tenkaichi series, which skips the locked Tekken style combat of the Budokai series for more free movement, arena style combat, which is why I call this game a bite-sized Tenkaichi. And I think that's where this game succeeds the most. As a kid, I would always just go into training mode and dash around as Vegeta, trying to make the coolest looking Dragon Ball Z battle possible. You also get tag team functionality, something we wouldn't even see until Tenkaichi 2 on the console side. At any moment you can switch characters, and I wouldn't say characters play super differently from each other outside their special moves, but it's still a cool feature to have. The actual hand-to-hand isn't super amazing. There's not really an in-depth combo system or anything. You're generally just getting in a few pokes before throwing in some dash attacks and charging for a special move. The real strategy though isn't how you position yourself. The energy attack you unleash is dependent on your current position around the enemy, so if you're currently below an enemy, you'll launch a different special attack than if you are to the left or above the enemy. Knowing your character's kit is important in that aspect, especially when certain moves have more cooldown than others. Story mode here is your standard arcade mode following individual character stories, some of the major battles of the main sagas, and a few what-if scenarios. Presentation wise, you're just getting a few PNGs and some text, which might be a little disappointing, but the combat is really what you're playing for, so I didn't mind too much, especially for a Game Boy Advance game at the time. Progression is tied to unlocking characters through the game's shop, and each character has 3 levels, which for some characters includes changing their form. For instance, Gohan goes from his regular Cell Games appearance to his ultimate appearance at level 3. Overall, it's probably the best Dragon Ball fighting game on the Game Boy Advance, but it doesn't really have much competition except for Taiketsu, and we know how that game ended up. Now, in most ways, Supersonic Warriors 2 improves over the first. From the presentation to the roster to a lot of pretty nice gameplay changes, it just has that mid-2000s clean aesthetic to it that I really appreciate. Even the government mandated dual screen functionality as a way of swapping characters isn't a bad addition. Story mode here is just about the same, basically functions as your arcade mode with a separate story for every character. I'm also a fan of the music in this game. The Game Boy Advance has a notoriously bad sound engine, and so it's great to hear some fully realized tracks, even some with some lyrics that you can roughly make out. The 3D effect in this game though, you might love or hate. It's definitely a lot more disorienting in the game compared to the parallax effect they used in the original, but I only found it a problem in certain stages, and only when you're closer to the ground. Being high up in the air, I really didn't notice. Like the original Supersonic Warriors, your time is going to be spent gunning for new characters, which means clearing the story mode or trying to beat some of the challenges in the game's other modes. It doesn't really have any fantastic RPG elements, and the gameplay itself doesn't have the same depth that you might encourage you to sit and practice with it for extended periods of time. So after you've collected all the characters, the game just feels kind of over. I think it's important to keep in mind that Dragon Ball Z Supersonic Warriors was not the first Dragon Ball Z game to, have free floating combat. I mean, even Dragon Ball Z Budokai, but even in that game, you can fly in the air. Going back to just like the arcade game, so Dragon Ball Z2 Super Battle, there was air combat in there as far as I remember. But I really give Supersonic Warriors credit for refining that formula before, at least in the 2D space, whereas Budokai Tenkaichi or the Sparking series really sold it in the 3D arena. But a lot of people seem to call Dragon Ball Z Legends or Idainaru Densetsu on the Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1 kind of a precursor to Supersonic Warriors, and this was a game that I thought was super interesting. Like, I knew it existed. It was one of those like white whales or whatever where the gameplay looked good when you like looked it up on YouTube or whatever, but you go to this game and the most I can say about this game is that it's an example of when you try to tune a game to be too much like Dragon Ball Z. Like, Supersonic Warriors has a good balance of controllability. There's not too much happening on the screen, even though that could be debatable with Supersonic Warriors 2. But in Dragon Ball Z Legends, essentially, like, there's just too much going on, too many camera shifts. Yeah, it matches with the series, but yeah, not my favorite Dragon Ball Z game. So that's kind of my like quick review of Idainaru Densetsu, if you're wondering. So a follower of the channel wants to know if I could talk about some of the development of the game, but strangely, as far as I know, there isn't a lot of great information out there. There are a couple of prototypes of the game floating around, but they're generally not super different from the final game. But reading a bunch of reviews from Japanese fans on Supersonic Warriors, I did come across the game Psychic Force, which a lot of people are saying may have inspired the combat in Supersonic Warriors. Psychic Force was basically a really cool and unique arcade game series later ported to home consoles, developed by Taito and released officially all the way back in 1996. And just like with Supersonic Warriors, you're primarily fighting in free flying 360-degree combat, only this time with psychic abilities instead of ki blasts. While there are melee options for most characters, the balance seems to be focused primarily on using energy blasts and maneuvering around. I'd say Psychic Force beats Supersonic Warriors out in the sheer creativity and variety and attacks between different characters. Now, Psychic Force isn't exactly the most prolific fighting game ever, but they did seem to get their mileage out of this formula. The game's X, Unmei no Sentaku, and Rosen Maiden apparently use the same engine as Psychic Force, and you can definitely tell. We'd also see some former Taito employees make the game Senko no Ronde on the Xbox 360 with that same familiar brand. And I think the series may have also inspired some of the Toho fighting games, which similarly focus on flying fighting. Also, on the topic of Supersonic Warriors, I've recently noticed a lot of these weird knockoff anime mobile games that basically rip the Supersonic Warriors gameplay. These games are probably deserving of their own video, honestly, but with the crazy amount of them that exist, it's going to take a while for that to finish. Overall, the Supersonic Warriors series may have died with the death of developer Kavya, but I'd love to see a modern day revival of the series and its formula in some way. The Psychic Force series does show that the formula could work with 3D models, so I think it could work out. Anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about today. If you enjoyed Dragon Ball gaming, feel free to subscribe to my channel. Alright, bye.